In the mid-1700s, the American colonies were growing quickly, but their relationship with Britain was becoming strained. After the costly French and Indian War, the British government needed money, and they looked to the colonies for revenue. New taxes and laws began appearing one after another. The Stamp Act of 1765 forced colonists to pay for official stamps on newspapers, legal papers, and everyday documents. To the colonists, this was more than just money, it was about rights. They argued that since they had no representatives in the British Parliament, it was unfair to be taxed at all. Their rallying cry became, "No taxation without representation." But Britain did not stop. Soon came the Townshend Acts, placing duties on glass, paint, paper, and tea. What had once been simple goods now became symbols of control. In towns and villages, conversations grew louder. Farmers, shopkeepers, and merchants all felt the pressure. People began boycotting British goods, refusing to buy anything imported. Across the colonies, a spirit of unity began to rise. Groups like the Sons of Liberty organized protests and spread news of resistance. Pamphlets and newspapers carried sharp words against British authority. Leaders such as Samuel Adams and others encouraged colonists to stand firm, declaring that they were not subjects to be ruled without consent, but free men deserving a voice. What started as anger over taxes soon became something much deeper. By the late 1760s, the colonies were no longer just distant territories of Britain, they were communities awakening to the idea of liberty. The seeds of revolution had been planted, and nothing would ever be the same again. By the late 1760s, Boston had become the heart of colonial anger. British soldiers were stationed in the city to enforce laws and collect taxes, but their presence only made people more hostile. Tensions between the soldiers and the townspeople grew sharper each day. On a cold night in March 1770, it finally erupted. A crowd of colonists surrounded a group of British soldiers, shouting insults and throwing snowballs mixed with stones. The soldiers, nervous and outnumbered, suddenly fired into the crowd. When the smoke cleared, 5 colonists lay dead. Among them was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent who became the first casualty of the Revolution. The event was quickly labeled the Boston Massacre, and it spread outrage across the colonies. Pamphlets and newspapers carried vivid accounts, turning the fallen men into martyrs for liberty. But the story did not end there. 3 years later, Britain passed the Tea Act of 1773, giving the East India Company control over colonial tea sales. Even though the tax on tea was small, colonists saw it as another trick to make them accept unfair authority. In Boston, resistance took a dramatic form. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded British ships in the harbor. With determination, they dumped more than 300 chests of tea into the icy water. Crowds cheered as the sea turned dark with leaves. This daring protest became known as the Boston Tea Party. For Britain, it was an open act of defiance. For the colonies, it was a powerful symbol of unity and courage. The Boston Massacre had shown the cost of oppression, and the Tea Party had shown the strength of resistance. Together, these events pushed America one step closer to open revolution. After the Boston Tea Party, Britain was furious. To punish Massachusetts, and to send a warning to all the colonies, Parliament passed a series of strict laws in 1774. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts, because to them, these rules were impossible to accept. The first blow came when Boston's harbor was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. Ships could no longer bring in food or supplies, and trade came to a halt. The lifeline of the city was cut. At the same time, the British dissolved the Massachusetts legislature, stripping the colony of its right to govern itself. Town meetings were tightly controlled, and local leaders had little power left. Another law allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England, far from colonial juries. To many colonists, this meant soldiers and officials could act as they pleased without fear of justice. On top of this, the Quartering Act forced colonists to house British soldiers in their homes, feeding and sheltering the very men sent to control them. But instead of breaking the colonies, the Intolerable Acts had the opposite effect. Outrage spread quickly beyond Massachusetts. Farmers in Virginia, merchants in New York, and leaders in Philadelphia all saw that if one colony could be treated this way, none of them were safe. Sympathy for Boston grew, and people began sending food and supplies to help the suffering city. For the first time, the colonies began to see themselves not just as separate regions, but as one people facing the same threat. The harshness of the intolerable acts lit a fire of unity. In response, colonial leaders decided to meet and discuss a collective answer. This gathering would soon become the First Continental Congress, marking a major step toward independence. In September of 1774, as anger over the intolerable acts spread, colonial leaders decided it was time to come together. From 12 of the 13 colonies, representatives traveled hundreds of miles to the city of Philadelphia. They met in Carpenter's Hall, a simple building that became the stage for something extraordinary, the First Continental Congress. For many of these men, it was the first time they had sat across the table from one another. They came from different regions, with different economies, religions, and ways of life. But one thing united them all: fear of losing their liberties under British rule. Voices rose, debates grew heated, but slowly a sense of common purpose began to take shape. Some leaders, like Patrick Henry of Virginia, urged bold action. He famously declared, "I am not a Virginian, but an American." Others, like John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, were more cautious, still hoping for reconciliation with Britain. Despite their differences, the Congress agreed on several key steps. They drafted a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, insisting that the colonies had the same rights as Englishmen and rejecting taxation without representation. They also organized a boycott of British goods, hoping economic pressure would force Parliament to repeal the harsh laws. And perhaps most importantly, they agreed to meet again if Britain ignored their petitions. News of the Congress spread quickly, and for ordinary colonists it was inspiring. For the first time, the colonies had spoken with one voice. Though they had not yet declared independence, the seed of a new nation was quietly growing. The First Continental Congress ended in October 1774, but its impact was enormous. It showed Britain that the colonies were no longer just scattered provinces. They were learning to act as one. The stage was set for confrontation, and soon, the first shots of revolution would be fired. By the spring of 1775, the conflict between Britain and the colonies had reached a boiling point. The British commander in Boston, General Thomas Gage, received orders to seize colonial weapons stored in the town of Concord, Massachusetts, and to arrest rebel leaders like Samuel Adams and John Hancock. But the colonists were ready. Through secret networks of riders and messengers, the Patriots kept a close watch on British movements. On the night of April 18, 1775, hundreds of British soldiers marched out of Boston under cover of darkness. Yet they could not keep their mission secret. That same night, the silversmith Paul Revere, along with William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, rode across the countryside shouting a warning. "The British are coming!" At dawn on April 19th, British troops arrived in the small town of Lexington. Waiting for them on the village green stood a group of about 70 colonial militia, ordinary farmers and tradesmen armed with muskets. For a moment, the two sides faced each other in tense silence. Then, suddenly, a shot rang out. No one knew who fired it, but that single gunshot became known as the shot heard around the world. The British fired into the militia, killing several men. The soldiers pressed on toward Concord, but there, the colonists were prepared in greater numbers. At the North Bridge, hundreds of Minutemen clashed with the Redcoats, forcing them to retreat. As the British marched back to Boston, colonial militia poured in from nearby towns, firing from behind fences, trees, and stone walls. By the end of the day, nearly 300 British soldiers were killed or wounded. What began as an attempt to seize weapons had turned into a bloody fight. The news spread rapidly across the colonies, electrifying everyone. The battles of Lexington and Concord marked the beginning of open war. From that day forward, the question was no longer if conflict would come, but how far it would go. The American Revolution had truly begun. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, the colonies knew that peace with Britain was slipping away. In May 1775, representatives once again gathered in Philadelphia. this time for the Second Continental Congress. But unlike the first meeting, the situation had changed dramatically. The colonies were now at war. The Congress faced urgent questions. How could the colonies defend themselves? Who would lead their forces? Some delegates still hoped for reconciliation, but others believed the fight for independence had already begun. Despite their differences, they agreed that they needed a united army. On June 15, 1775, they made a historic decision. They chose George Washington of Virginia as Commander-in-Chief of the newly formed Continental Army. Washington's leadership, reputation, and military experience made him the perfect figure to unite the colonies. He accepted humbly, promising to serve without pay, and set out for Boston to take command of the troops. Meanwhile, Congress also began acting like a national government. They printed paper money to pay soldiers, created committees to manage supplies, and even sought foreign allies. At the same time, they sent the Olive Branch petition to King George III, pleading for peace and asking him to protect colonial rights. But the king refused to read it. Instead, he declared the colonies to be in open rebellion. The rejection of peace hardened colonial resolve. The delegates realized that their struggle was no longer about resisting unfair taxes. It was becoming a fight for full independence. The Second Continental Congress would remain in session throughout the war, guiding the colonies, raising armies, and making decisions that shaped a new nation. But in the summer of 1775, as Washington rode out to take command, the Congress knew they were stepping onto a path from which there was no turning back. By the summer of 1776, the colonies had been at war with Britain for more than a year. Battles had been fought around Boston, New York, and Canada, but the larger question still remained: were the colonies fighting only for their rights as Englishmen, or were they fighting to create a brand new nation? Many people were hesitant at first, still hoping for reconciliation. But as King George III rejected every petition and sent more troops, the idea of independence began to spread like wildfire. Pamphlets such as Thomas Paine's Common Sense argued boldly that it was absurd for a small island like Britain to rule a vast continent like America. Ordinary colonists read these words and began to believe that freedom was the only path forward. In June 1776, the Second Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft a formal declaration. The task of writing fell largely to a young Virginian, Thomas Jefferson. For days, he worked in a rented room in Philadelphia, crafting words that would inspire generations. On July 2nd, the Congress voted in favor of independence. 2 days later, on July 4, 1776, they officially adopted the Declaration of Independence. The document boldly stated that all men are created equal, and that governments derive their power from the consent of the governed. Most importantly, it declared that the 13 colonies were no longer under British rule. They were free and independent states. Copies of the Declaration were printed and read aloud in town squares across the colonies. Crowds cheered, church bells rang, and soldiers celebrated. In New York, people even tore down a statue of King George and melted it into bullets for the war. The Declaration of Independence was more than a statement, it was a promise. It told the world that America was ready to stand on its own, no matter the cost. But declaring independence was only the beginning. The hardest battles still lay ahead. Once independence was declared, the colonies faced the full might of the British Empire. The war would stretch for years, marked by key battles that shaped the destiny of America. The first major clash came at Bunker Hill in 1775, just outside Boston. Colonial militia, poorly trained and short on ammunition, dug in on the high ground. As waves of British soldiers charged uphill, the Patriots held their fire until the enemy was close. Twice the British were driven back, but on the third assault the colonists ran out of powder. Though forced to retreat, the Americans had shown that they could stand up to professional British troops. The battle proved that this was no minor rebellion, it was a real war. In 1777, the struggle reached a turning point at the Battle of Saratoga in New York. British General Burgoyne had marched south with a large army, hoping to cut New England off from the rest of the colonies. But American forces, led by General Horatio Gates and aided by Benedict Arnold, surrounded the British at Saratoga. After heavy fighting, Burgoyne was forced to surrender his entire army. This stunning victory lifted American spirits and convinced France to openly join the war as an ally, providing ships, soldiers, and supplies. Years later, the final act came at Yorktown in 1781. British General Cornwallis had moved his army to the Virginia coast, hoping to resupply by sea. But Washington saw an opportunity. With French troops under General Rochambeau and the French Navy blocking the harbor, the Americans laid siege to Yorktown. Cannon fire rained down for days until Cornwallis had no choice but to surrender. The victory at Yorktown effectively ended major fighting in the colonies. These battles, Bunker Hill, Saratoga, and Yorktown, were milestones on the road to freedom. Each one showed the resilience of the Americans, the growing strength of their allies, and the slow but steady collapse of British control. The war was not yet officially over, but the dream of the American colonies had courage and determination, but against the world's strongest empire, they needed more than spirit, they needed allies. At first, most nations watched cautiously, unsure if the rebellion could survive. But after the stunning American victory at Saratoga in 1777, the tide began to turn. The most important ally was France. Old rivals of Britain, the French saw a chance to weaken their enemy. In 1778, France officially recognized American independence and signed treaties of alliance. French money began flowing into the colonies, along with weapons, supplies, and, most importantly, soldiers and ships. French generals like Marquis de Lafayette even fought side by side with American troops, bringing European training and experience. Soon after, Spain also joined the war against Britain, not as a direct ally of America but as a partner of France. Spanish forces attacked British positions in the Mississippi Valley and captured key forts in Florida, stretching Britain's resources thin. At the same time, the Netherlands provided loans and became another enemy of Britain in the wider global conflict. The American Revolution, once a local uprising, had now become an international war. Battles were fought not only in North America but also in the Caribbean, Europe, and even India as Britain defended its empire from multiple sides. Foreign support gave the American cause the strength it needed to survive. French ships helped trap the British at Yorktown. Spanish victories weakened British supply lines. Dutch bankers funded the costly fight. Without these allies, the revolution might have collapsed under the weight of Britain's power. By the early 1780s, Britain was exhausted, fighting wars across the globe while facing an enemy in America that refused to give up. The help of foreign nations had tipped the balance, turning what seemed like an impossible rebellion into a winnable war. By 1781, after the American and French victory at Yorktown, the fighting in the colonies largely came to an end. But peace did not arrive overnight. For nearly 2 more years, negotiations dragged on in Europe, as Britain, America, France, and Spain tried to settle their disputes. The war had become global, and each nation wanted to secure the best possible outcome. In 1782, American representatives, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and John Jay, began talks with British officials in Paris. These men worked tirelessly, balancing diplomacy with caution. Britain was weary of war and eager to cut its losses, while the Americans insisted on nothing less than full independence. Finally, on September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. The agreement was groundbreaking. Britain formally recognized the United States as a free and independent nation, the very thing colonists had dreamed of for years. The treaty also set boundaries. The new nation stretched from the Atlantic Ocean in the east to the Mississippi River in the west, and from Canada in the north to Spanish Florida in the south. For ordinary Americans, the news was cause for celebration. Bells rang, cannons roared, and people cheered in the streets. After 8 long years of war, sacrifice, and uncertainty, independence was finally real. The Treaty of Paris not only ended the American Revolution, but also reshaped the world. A new republic had been born, founded on the principles of liberty and self-government. Britain's empire was humbled, while America stood at the dawn of its national journey. The revolution was over, but the story of building a nation had only just begun.